Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII podcast. I'm absolutely honoured to welcome Dr. Alison Weir, renowned historian in both the Tudor era and beyond. She has written some of my favourite books, including non-fiction and fiction, and today we're going to be talking about her latest novel, The Cardinal, The Secret Life of Thomas Wolsey. How are you today, Dr. Weir?
I'm fine, thank you, Emma. How are you?
I'm very, very well. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about this book. I remember meeting you in Leamington Spa and we were talking about the wonderful and fantastic life that he has, albeit tragic. And I'm just so excited to be able to learn more about the process of how you went about writing this book and how the life of Cardinal Wolsey appealed to you.
Well, it was back 2 or 3 years ago, and I was launching another novel, an earlier novel on Henry VIII, and we had a dinner after the launch party, and I was with the author Sarah Gristwood and various other people, including my agent, and we were talking about ideas for another book, and I was thinking of doing a novel on Richard III, and wondering if I really wanted to live with Richard III for the next few years, because that's what it would entail. And Sarah Gristwood turned around and just said, how about The Cardinal, a novel of power? Let's redress the balance, because Cromwell's had all the publicity. I remember my agent's eyes just lit up, and he said, now I could sell that, he said. And it went from there. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, the Cardinal, I haven't written a book about him, I haven't researched him in depth, and I'd have to do more research. But actually, I so enjoyed the project because I was focusing on Wolsey the man. I knew a lot about his political life, but I didn't know so much about his private life. And that was my big challenge.
I was just about to say that when you normally think of prominent Tudor figures, your mind would automatically go to, as you said, Thomas Cromwell or Sir Thomas More.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I thought you were going to stop speaking. I was just going to say to Thomas More, because before Wolf Hall, we had a man for all seasons. And so there was More had an elevated cultural profile after that.
And Thomas Wolsey, despite being a prominent figure and probably one of the most important figures in Tudor history, at least in the early years of Henry VIII's reign, he's not been talked about a lot. He's more like a side character in a lot of either books or television shows. And considering the fact that he was known as Alter Rex, meaning other king, for his extravagant wealth and position within Henry's court, he's quite overlooked despite his great accomplishments. Do you think that's mainly because of the fact that other courtiers were jealous of his power and wealth, or was it something else that made him overlooked?
I think they were. Definitely, there was a lot of jealousy and a lot of resentment, and his enemies all united to bring him down in the end when they saw their opportunity. And of course, they had a catalyst in that in Anne Boleyn. But he was in power for far longer than Thomas Cromwell, who was an equally brilliant man, but in a different way. And I just think he's been overlooked because he perhaps symbolises the old order that that was gradually being eroded. The Roman Catholic, when England was Catholic, and he was a cardinal of the Catholic Church. And I think that may be one reason why, because Cromwell represents the new, the radical, and Wolsey isn't seen as sexy in that way politically.
A lot of people seem to have this idea that even though Thomas Cromwell was actually in the household of Cardinal Wolsey, he was quite a good friend to him. A lot of people seem to think that he had this desire to overrule him and take over his power.
No, Cromwell was very fond of Wolsey. He served him for several years, and he was very distressed at Wolsey's fall. But at the same time, his own career was gathering momentum. But he did work behind the scenes to try and mitigate the effects of Wolsey's fall. For example, he lobbied members of Parliament to ensure that Wolsey wasn't prosecuted by act of attainder. And we have to remember also that Cromwell was resented, and it was some of those same enemies who united to bring him down in his turn. Both of them, of course, were seen by the older nobility of being upstarts because of their lowly blood, as it was seen, greasy genealogy, as Wolsey's was described.
And in the book, you do have a big bit where you do look at the relationship between Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell, but that's not the only relationships that you do look at in the book. His relationship with his king, Henry VIII, he has a quite fatherly relationship with him, his relationship with his mistress, Joan. And finally, and in my opinion, the most important was his relationship with God, as all three of these relationships have something that they give to Wolsey, but they also take away. For example, he loves God and he devotes himself to it, but he also feels that perhaps God doesn't approve of him because of the way that he sins in the way he is with Joan. Which of the three did you find the most interesting to write about?
I think the most interesting for me was his relationship with Joan Lark, very closely followed by that with Henry VIII. Originally, the book, there was far more emphasis in the book on the political Wolsey and his relationship with Henry. Joan was relegated to a more minor role. That's how I wrote it and conceived it, because I wanted Wolsey to be seen as a political man, an operator on an international stage. And I wanted Joan to have her proper proportioned role in the book, because she's very much in the background. It's like the wives of Henry VIII. They seem to assume a great importance these days, but when you look at the letters and papers of the reign of Henry VIII, for example, you will see that they occupy very little of it, apart from when they were being divorced or beheaded. And so when my editors saw this, they loved the book, but they wanted far more about Joan Lark. So I had to go back and add in a lot of that. And in the course of this, all this editing, I mean, I had got a lot on. He was a reluctant priest to start with, and that he not found God at the end, but he became far more religious and attended to his religious duties and acted as a good shepherd towards the end of his life. I was asked to bring that out more in the book. So that was it. But it was the relationship with Henry that really absorbed me, because I think Wolsey saw him as a son. I think he was disappointed in his own son. And of course, he became friends with Henry when his son was a baby. And so he didn't know how his son was going to grow up. But I think Henry became like a son to him. I think Henry regarded him almost as a father figure, because his relationship with his own father, Henry VII, had been pretty unsatisfactory.
Just to drive a bit more attention to his relationship with Joan Lark before we talk about his political career, can you first explain to people who perhaps might not understand why his relationship with Joan Lark was so scandalous? Why didn't priests or religious men be allowed to have relationships?
Well, the church forbade priests, men in holy orders, to marry. Priests could not marry. They're supposed to be chaste as well. They're supposed to, they were literally, some of them were monks. Monks were vowed to poverty, chastity, and obedience, and priests were not supposed to be worldly men. Ha ha. Because many were career, especially in the higher echelons of the church, like bishops and archdeacons, and then, of course, archbishops and cardinals. A lot of them were just career politicians, because the church was a way to advancement in those days, especially if you were lowly born and had a brain on you. So I think it was against the rules of the church. We go back to the church fathers for this, who saw chastity as the highest state. And the early church allowed marriage. It was William the Conqueror coming into England who made sure that the church conformed to strict European lines. And that was in the 11th century. So Wolsey would have been frowned on, but of course it was accepted that churchmen were, venal. A lot of them lived with housekeepers who were their mistresses. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself had 2 bastards. It's not unusual, but it's kept hush hush. And Wolsey served Henry VIII, who considered himself, you might not believe this, a very virtuous man. And it did not reflect on his virtue or his greatness to have this very prominent servant living in sin, as it would have been seen.
That just drives me to my next point, because throughout reading your book, I didn't know much about his relationship with Joan Lark, but I can see, as you say in the book, that it ends very suddenly in 1519, which is coincidentally the same time that the king's mistress, Bessie Blount, becomes pregnant with his only acknowledged illegitimate son. And it kind of got me wondering of whether, seeing that the king was allowing his mistress to have this son, and that he was acknowledging it, do you believe that the forced removal of Joan's 2 children with Thomas Wolsey and the pain it must have inflicted had built up over the years, that it might have caused her to question or regret the relationship she had with Thomas Wolsey?
Possibly, yes. Yes, I think that there may have been some resentment built up. There is a time when they argue, and she marries, and he thinks the relationship is going to go on. And of course, the husband has no intention of doing that, even though Wolsey's made it clear to him he's going to be a marriage of convenience. And Joan turns around and says, I can now live in my life in public. There is a certain amount of resentment. But I think in Henry's case, Henry was we would see him as hypocritical. But he is seeing Wolsey as a churchman. And it does not reflect well on Henry to have a churchman who's living in sin and has bastards. He's very against this. I think the real Henry VIII would have been the same. And of course, scandal touched Wolsey. Wolsey was always being branded as a fornicator and a pimp for the king, and that matters reached a head when it came to the fact that after the birth of Henry Fitzroy, the king's illegitimate son, the mother of the child, Elizabeth Blount, was found a husband. Henry told Wolsey to find a husband and marry her off, and his relationship with her continued after that marriage. She bore a daughter who Elizabeth Norton, with good reason, thinks was Henry's. But Wolsey arranged a marriage with her with a baron. and there was an outcry about this. The marrying of Elizabeth Blount, it meant it was encouraging young girls to indulge in fornication to get good husbands, basically. And Henry didn't like the scandal because Wolsey had arranged this marriage. It all fell on Wolsey, this scandal. It might have been at this point that Henry made noises, get rid of your mistress. And it's very hypocritical on a personal level.
I suppose in a sense that if you'd look at it maybe from Henry VIII, he was trying to protect the cardinal because he did see him as a father almost, and perhaps he was trying to say, like, if you quietly remove the mistress, the scandal goes away. But I think it had already done the damage by then.
Well, I think the relationship must have been discreet because there's so little about it. You get it mentioned later on in sources. There are oblique references to it, but I think people probably knew and kept quiet because of Wolsey's status and his power. But I think it was kept discreet because if it hadn't been, we would know more about it. It's the same case with Mary Boleyn.
And in regards to his power, as we move on to his political career, Thomas Wolsey, as many people know, served two kings, Henry VII and his son, most famously Henry VIII. And his dedication and loyalty is undeniable in how much he achieved for both the king and the country. And a lot of people probably do not know how much he actually achieved because we're so focused on his scandals, or most popular, his failure in giving the king we say divorce, but for him it was an annulment of his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to Anne Boleyn. And I was wondering if you could shed a light on what the cardinal's most notable successes were during his time to Henry VIII, because we don't focus on that quite a lot.
Well, I think that he took the burden of administrative government from Henry's shoulders. Henry made a lot of the decisions, but relied heavily on Wolsey's advice. But Wolsey was far more than a very loyal minister, a loyal servant, someone who, was a smooth operator, a fixer for the king. He was a statesman on an international stage, and he was dedicated to European, well, I say world peace, we're talking about Christian Europe. He was dedicated to forging peace between princes because he thought that friendly relationships would encourage trade. It would be beneficial all round instead of these dreadful wars that kept being fought. I mean, you get treaties of perpetual peace, they'd last about 10 years, if that. And so he did negotiate several peace treaties during his time, and he tried to maintain a balance of power between England and the two great European powers, which is France and Spain, which is also joined to the Holy Roman Emperor under the Emperor Charles V. He's also King of Spain. And Wolsey kept the balance between these two powers, turning to first one, then the other, depending on how hostile they became due to events. And he maintained this balance of power with Henry, of course. And he strove all through his professional life to achieve peace. And I think that's it didn't last. You can't say it's a lasting achievement. But he also showed how loyal and service and of great use a public servant could be.
Yes, I remember reading in your book is when the cardinal was trying to achieve peace with France and obviously not doing anything with Spain, that Catherine of Aragon wasn't quite happy about it, and he was seeing as not showing his loyalty to the Queen. I did find that quite funny to read about, because you could imagine how she would have reacted when he said, "Oh, we're going to have peace with France," who was Spain's natural enemy.
Yes, well, I think she resented his influence, full stop, because until her father, Ferdinand, betrayed Henry in early 1514, and in a line with Henry's allies enemies behind his back, when he was supposed to be fighting them with him and gaining him the crown of France. How naive can you get? Henry turned on Catherine, and until then, she had been one of his chief advisors, and his counsellors were worried that England was being governed by Spain at one remove. And Wolsey, by then, his power is really burgeoning, and he's almost at his peak. And I can see this resentment. He has replaced her as one of the king's natural counsellors, and she believed, because Wolsey at that time steered Henry to an alliance with France rather than Spain and the Empire, she always saw him after that as a Francophile, working against her and her native land. And she deplored his private life. She knew about it quite clearly.
It's almost quite tragic in the sense that Cardinal Wolsey did not get on with either of Henry's two wives. It seemed both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn really did not like him. They liked him when he was useful to them in a sense.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think Catherine of Aragon deplored the man, although on the surface relations were cordial between them. But she blamed him for the divorce. She blamed him. She thought he had put the idea in Henry's head. And Henry challenged him in open court in 1529 and said, can you tell the truth about this? And he said, no. Wolsey challenged Henry, rather. And Henry turns around and said, no, you were really against it from the start. And we know from Wolsey's own testimony that he spent 2 hours on his knees trying to persuade Henry not to go ahead with this case. He could see what it would do to the unity of Christendom. And Catherine resented him for that. Anne's resentment, I think, is far more personal. I think she was very angered by his dismissal of her betrothal, if it was a betrothal, to Henry Percy, the future Earl of Northumberland. And she didn't like being called that foolish girl yonder in the court. When she was sent home, she smoked, we are told. And I think she wanted to get a little bit of vengeance here, or rather a lot, actually. And she too thought Wolsey was working against her. And it literally became a power struggle between her and him. And he was by far the more deadly enemy than Catherine had been.
I think it's noted that when you get on the wrong side of Anne Boleyn, she really does let you have it. You've seen how many of her enemies she's let rip on.
And her friends too. She alienated quite a lot of people. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, who was thick as thieves with her and a strong part of her faction, later complained that she'd used words to him that you wouldn't use to a dog.
That's probably why he turned her on her a little bit. I think a lot of people think that's exactly why.
She alienated a lot of the people who could have helped her. And in the end, when her fall came about, she did not have the might of Catholic Europe and Spain behind her as Catherine did. Anne had no one but the king's great love. And once she lost that, it was it, curtains.
And in regards to the divorce of Catherine of Aragon with Henry VIII, we have a lot of questions and theories regarding the divorce and many events in Tudor history, and that often leads to a lot of what-if questions or alternate history questions. And one of my favourite ones is, if the Cardinal, hypothetically, had been able to secure Henry VIII for the divorce in 1529 or 1530, do you believe that he would have still remained in power or maintained a similar influence over the king during the king's second marriage to Anne Boleyn? Or do you believe he would have eventually been removed because Anne Boleyn held a bit more sway over the king?
I think Anne would have expressed a certain gratitude, and that would have been, I think, it would have been good by Wolsey. I'm sorry, I'm being very cynical about this, but I think Anne didn't want any rivals for power. And I think that he would have, I don't think his influence would have been as much. He may have survived quite well, for a while. But I don't think he would have, I don't think his influence would have been as much.
And it's such a shame that he actually wasn't able to get the divorce, because I remember I said to you earlier, I was reading your book on Mary Boleyn, and it's seen in 1528 that he does get the dispensation to
the secret dispensation. Yes, it's married within the first and second degrees, and that means he could marry his mother or his sister, because his relationship with Anne Boleyn would have been as incestuous as his relationship with Catherine was, even more so, because canon law provided that, yes, you could marry, your deceased brother's wife, provided they hadn't had children. And it's not a question of whether the marriage was consummated, it's whether children had been born of it. In the case of Anne Boleyn, Mary Boleyn, Mary had borne the king a child. Anne was forbidden to him. No pope could have dispensed with that.
I remember saying to you, we believe her daughter Catherine is the king's illegitimate daughter and not her son Henry Carey, which some people tend to believe.
Catherine was born first, and it's I think it's very likely that she was the king's daughter, because of the entails on the lands granted to William Carey, Mary Boleyn's husband, stipulate that they can only go to the child of his body, the son of his body, and they do go to Henry Carey. Property law in those days was quite stiff on these kind of things.
And as we do see, Mary Boleyn does feature a little bit in the book. We do see that she pops in and out, as does Anne Boleyn. And naturally, because of how successful and influential the Cardinal was and the events that must have occurred in his life, there must have been some things that you can have in the book. Was there anything that you really wanted in the book, but you just weren't able to keep, either for length or just because?
No, in fact, the book wasn't as long. It wasn't at its limit with pages, because my editors sometimes quite often ask me to add more material. And there's usually more material to add than there is to delete. And so I leave a margin for that. So space wasn't a problem on that. No, I included everything I want to. I always do. I've had discussions about certain passages in fiction that whether they work or not, but it's all negotiable. And I included what I wanted.
One of my favourite things about reading your novels about influential figures, and especially the six queens of Henry VIII, is how much you manage to bring these characters to life and how realistic they feel. Because with your book, you've managed to bring him to life in a realistic way. But anything that we say, we can see that's fiction because we don't have the real life conversations. You've managed to make them sound realistic. Did you rely on a lot of documents and letters for how certain figures spoke or how they might have acted?
Yes, I did. But don't forget, I've been looking at these sources in depth since the 1960s. I'm quite familiar with the language. I mean, this is the language that was written down. People may not have spoken the same way. The conversation we're having, if you wrote it down, it might not be grammatically correct. You know what I mean? It wouldn't be written down the same way. That's what we know. We have reports of conversations. And what I did rely on, I relied on a wealth of information for original source material for it. Sometimes I've taken sources, source quotes out of context, but they fit the situation. And I did rely very heavily on George Cavendish's Life of Cardinal Wolsey, because Cavendish was his gentleman usher. He knew him very well. He was close to him, particularly at the end of his life. And Cavendish is a very, very important source.
If we go back to the Tudors, and I was speaking earlier about how there are so many Tudor books and films and television products that we have, but there are also numerous portrayals of the Cardinal himself, albeit in smaller roles. And this includes Anne of a Thousand Days, Carry On Henry.
One of my favourite films.
Oh, I absolutely love that film.
They're desperate to put their heads on the block by the end of it.
And we also have some of the latest ones being Wolf Hall, The Spanish Princess, and The Tudors. And I wanted to ask, when you first saw the scene of The Tudors, we have the ending scene for the Cardinal being, spoiler alert for those who haven't seen it, being that the Cardinal commits suicide, one that I don't really agree with. And I wanted to ask what your opinion was on this, because we know that it's not historically accurate in the fact that...
Why did they do it? It's the same. Why did they make two of Henry's sisters into one that was completely mythical? Well, one married the King of Scots, one married the King of France. We've got one here called Margaret who married the King of Portugal and killed him. So, I mean, this is just weird. Why? It's senseless. I had to suspend belief. I enjoyed it as drama. Jonathan Rhys-Meyers is very fit and nice to look at. But I had to just think, this is not the Tudors. This is just a television drama. It's in Fantasyland.
I think perhaps if they'd wrote based off the Tudors but dramatised, people probably wouldn't have watched it and then immediately took it for fact, because there are some people I know today that still come over and go, oh, Henry VIII slept with this or slept with this person, or Anne Boleyn did this, and I'm like, no, it's fiction, this never happened. And then
I've had this. I remember walking around Hever Castle one year, and I was pointing out inaccuracies they have since corrected in some of the exhibits to my cousin, and this woman turned around and said, please stop spoiling it for me. And I wasn't even on duty, or I wasn't doing anything professional, but people like to believe what they want to believe. They want the romanticism of it.
And unfortunately, I've had that as well. I remember going to the Tower of London. I was with my mother, who's not the best with history, but she likes learning. And I was explaining, how Anne Boleyn and the Traitor's Gate, how that's a common myth and things. And all I could hear was someone beside me going, but she did. It's in the Tudors. And I said, no.
Oh, God, I know. I've had it. Somebody said, Richard III definitely did not murder the Prince in the Tower. This is on Facebook. I know it's all there in The White Queen. And I thought, however good a novel The White Queen is, it's a novel. It's fiction. It cannot replace historical research.
I know that's one of the biggest debates, isn't it? Because from the White Queen, the White Princess, and the Spanish Princess, everybody now believes that Margaret Beaufort was the one who killed the princes.
Oh, that comes from a drama documentary from the mid-90s. And you may have seen that, about all the princes in the Tower. And it showed, the only source is that people could rely on, or not rely on, is a 17th century source that says a certain countess had plotted. But it's 17th century. We have nothing at all in no contemporary evidence that Margaret Beaufort was involved. And if she or her son Henry VII had been, the person who would have really reacted to it would have been Margaret of Burgundy, Henry's greatest enemy. And she never said a word about that. No one tried to pin that on Henry.
I think that's the unfortunate thing about these historical films, is that we love seeing them, but it just brings so much drama to the stage. You have so many people.
Historians. I know that there's, I mean, when I was promoting my biography of Elizabeth of York in 2013, I did lots of events. And a lot of these events, people were saying, is it true that the younger prince was brought back to court and, someone was substituted, in the Tower? And I'm thinking, hello, he would have been known at court, It's just incredible. And it turns out it's in The White Queen. Again, it's fiction. You can invent things in fiction. I have myself, but I usually put a very long author's note to explain what I've done. But sometimes I get people writing to me and saying, why this, why that, and I say, if you've not read the author's note, no, I haven't. So you don't, even if you do it, they don't take any notice. I'm not saying everyone's like that, Daniel.
I always read the author's note with everything I read with fiction, because for certain things that I don't know about, for example, I'm not the most knowledgeable on, for say, Catherine Parr, for example, but when I read Firebrand, I was so glad that Elizabeth Fremantle had the author's note going, not everything that happens in the book is fictional. So I think people need to read the author's notes, because not everything in fiction is completely based off fact.
They do need to read the author. They certainly do, and that's why they're there. You can't change anything. You might telescope events. If Catherine of Aragon was Wolsey went to see Catherine of Aragon 3 times, I might telescope it into one interview.
And I absolutely agree with you, because I believe that over the last, I would like to say 10 years, I've noticed a shift in how people, when they read historical fiction, they don't want the drama. They actually want it to be as historically accurate as possible. And I think that shows a big shift, because I think that what we saw with the early 2000s of the Tudors is people were being sucked in through the drama, through the sexual imagery and everything. And now we've kind of shifted from that into more accurate and more informative forms of media, rather than just let's put a Hollywood stamp on it by having lots of sex, lots of hot, attractive actors and things. So I think that's quite refreshing to see.
I think so too, and that does worry me. It worries me. Jonathan Rhys-Meyers reportedly refused to be made up to look like Henry, which I found rather disconcerting, because he didn't look a bit like Henry. He did develop an Irish accent in series 4, which was a bit strange.
It was a little bit annoying when in the 4th season he wasn't as large as Henry VIII would have been, and he was quite attractive still in the final season, so it was a bit disconcerting.
The way they stylize it all, I don't like. I mean, nowadays it's very hard. I mean, when they do like period dramas and they're dramatizing like great novels like Victorian literature, everything's perfect. The costumes are perfect. Why can't they get the Tudor period perfect?
Whilst if you look at Firebrand, I felt that they did the costumes a great justice, because they used actual portraits.
Yes, I know. I saw the best French hood I've seen on screen. That
I absolutely agree. I remember going to see it, and that's one of the reasons I quite like Firebrand, is also Jude Law as Henry VIII, as he wasn't afraid to be
quite good, yes. I mean, quite good. It wasn't I think the trouble was, it's very static. It's set in this castle. It's in the same castle. God knows where it was. It didn't have anywhere like that. I didn't purposely read the book because I knew I was going to be writing my own novel. I didn't want to colour it. So I haven't read the book. I haven't had time since I wrote my own novel on Catherine Parr. So I don't know how close to the book it is, but she is a brilliant historian, and I'm sure that they have made decisions there.
Well, as somebody who has watched the film and read the book, I can tell you that they do stick to the material she has in it. However, the entire book takes place from just after Catherine Howard has died to the end of Catherine's life, whilst the movie is more like when Catherine's actually married to Henry, so it doesn't take place over the whole book. But I feel like they used a lot of the material.
We're talking about an itinerant court. It was the setting that I had issues with, which I had issues. And there were other things. But I mean, I've got options on my own book. Stars have optioned my novel on Ella of Aquitaine for a series. And then they want to do one on another of my books on Isabella of France.
In regards to the image of an actor and whether they portray the character, Thomas Wolsey, as we have said, has been portrayed numerous times. And with each kind of portrayal, there's always something that the viewers or historians don't necessarily agree with the Tudors being the main one, mainly for how the cardinal's death was portrayed. I was wondering, if you had to pick an ideal actor for who would portray the cardinal, who would you choose and why?
Nowadays, oh goodness me, Simon Russell Beale, possibly. My mind goes blank when people ask me to choose actors or actresses because I only get to see certain films.
You can always pick someone from the theatre if you like. I think a lot of people.
I'd say Simon Russell Beale is theatre.
Ooh, I can see that though as well.
Yeah, I can too. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Gary Oldman, possibly.
Ooh.
What do you think?
I can actually see that though, because I remember seeing Sean Bean play Thomas Cromwell, and I couldn't see that until I actually watched it, and I thought he was phenomenal. But I can see Gary
Are you
Oldman
talking
playing
about
that.
Sean Bean? What did he play that in?
I believe it's Shard Lake.
Oh,
I
Charlotte, of course, I haven't seen that. I must see that. I must see that. And do you remember something I wanted to see? Charlotte, I'm making a note of that. Frantic.
You're more than welcome. But I'm trying to think of whether Gary Oldman would be best playing younger cardinal or older cardinal, because he does get quite large at the end of his life, but not. I think we should put that forward. If anybody ever wants to make a Life of the Cardinal or make a TV show of that, that's who we should put forward, Gary Oldman.
I thought Sam Neill made a very good Wolsey in the end scene.
I think they just wanted to add a bit of drama to the end of it, and the fact was it was just think it was so historically inaccurate, because I think the ending that he actually had in real life, where he dies on the way to prison, would have been so much more intriguing to watch, because they could have played it out as if, the cardinal's trying to live, but he's probably also thankful he's not going to the Tower as well.
Yes, I know. I think he feared what would await him. I don't think Henry would have executed him.
I think he would have tried to have saved, if he couldn't have saved him from punishment, I think he would have tried to have just kept him in prison, because I don't think he actually wanted to execute him, but I think he was being pressured a lot by the other favourites he had.
I think he's got it in one. Don't forget, he's a man. Wolsey's a man of the cloth. You're not supposed to execute churchmen. I mean, we do see it happening in history, but Wolsey was he. But I think that what Henry wanted to do was show to Anne Boleyn through a trial, perhaps a show trial, that Wolsey was not, Wolsey was not guilty of the things of which his enemies had been accusing him, and he he felt he had to try the case, and I think that's why he was paving the way for his comeback. That might be a controversial view, but that's my view. I don't think at this stage of his reign Henry would have considered executing Wolsey. A few years later, yes, I think he would have done.
I think he's also, without trying to sound rude, I think he was quite lucky to have passed away when he did, because had he lived another 6 years, he perhaps would have been in a lot more trouble, because as we've seen with Anne Boleyn, she's kind of the catalyst of when Henry VIII starts going off on all the rest of the courtiers. Like, no one is safe really after Anne Boleyn's death, so I think he's quite fortunate to have passed away prior to that, because he probably would not have lasted long.
I think the change came before that, and it comes in 1534, when the Nun of Kent and her associates are executed, and the Nun of Kent spoke out. She was seen as the Holy Maid of Kent. She had these visions, and she prophesied that Henry would not live long, and people listened to her. That was if he married Anne Boleyn, of course. People wouldn't listen, but people listened to her, and Henry didn't like this. And this one, I think people were quite shocked when, in November 1534, Henry ordered he had her associates executed. And this is the first blood shed in the great matter. In 1535, we're into a very different ballgame, because it goes one worse. So he executes Thomas More. He executes John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, who'd just been made a cardinal. He executes Carthusian monks who've opposed his marriage to Anne Boleyn, and quite savagely too. So you can see how ruthless the king is becoming. But in 1530, he hasn't become that ruthless.
And before we go, Dr. Weir, I wanted to ask you, for people who are just learning more about the Cardinal thanks to your book, or perhaps don't know that much about him, could you recommend any books besides your own?
Fantastic biography, an extensive one by Peter Gwynne, which I would recommend, and one by John Matusiak, but also read Cavendish. He's very readable.
And I think everybody should read all of them, but also read your book, The Cardinal, because I devoured it. I absolutely loved it. I was I know. I remember telling you that I was listening to the audiobook for it. It made it feel like I was watching a show, quite honestly, through how much
Wow.
drama was coming through. But the book itself, oh, for anybody who hasn't read it, please read it and read Alison's other books as well, because I have quite a big collection here in my little library. But I recommend reading it. And I just want to thank you so, so much, Dr. Weir, for joining me today and for having this wonderful conversation, as it has been a dream of mine for quite some time.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. This is the ill-fated wives of Henry VIII signing off. Thank you and have a lovely day.